We return this morning to the story of Jonah on board the ship that he is running away from the Lord upon. And more specifically, the story of Jonah and the sailors, which you remember is sandwiched between Jonah's disobedience, meaning running away from the call of God, and the prayer that we will see coming later. This little passage of scripture we're working on represents very clearly what happens when a man is disobedient to the explicit call of God. So we continue our examination of Jonah in the ship in Jonah chapter 1. Now, you remember last week we said that it was the Lord himself who hurled a great storm at the ship and which Jonah flees, right? This is not just some accidental storm that pops up to get Jonah's attention. This is a sovereign act of the providence of God. But Jonah sleeps through the storm because, as I suggested last week, he's oblivious to his own sinfulness. He's so convinced that his choice is right that he can sleep like a baby in the bottom of a ship. He sees no danger in running away from the Lord. So the storm doesn't waken him, but the captain does. The captain goes down below and wakes him up, seeking for him to join the others in this pagan ritual of appealing to the various gods, because you see, the men believe that there's some sort of causal link, some sort of causal connection between them and the storm. And they're right. So the captain going down to wake up Jonah is a lot more than just get up and help us throw the cargo overboard. Okay, this is get up and help us figure out who's at fault here. Now, I want to insert an observation at this point. This story of Jonah is very familiar, isn't it? I mean, we tell this story to kids in Sunday school and vacation Bible school and so forth, and everybody seems to know this story. It's so familiar to us. And that familiarity means that we miss some things. We have a tendency to overlook some details in the midst of the story. This particular story, this particular part of the story, for example, raises some interesting questions that no one ever seems to ask. I've never heard them asked. In fact, I have 6 of them from this passage this morning I would like you to observe. Very interesting questions. And I think the questions that I'm raising will help recognize some details here that actually tell us much about Jonah and his rebellion against the Lord. So I'm not just posing questions that are interesting. I want to pose questions that drive us to understand, okay, who is this Jonah and what is his rebellion actually all about? All right? So let's go to verse 7 now in this section, chapter 1, Jonah chapter 1, verse 7 and 8. And they said to one another, so the they is undoubtedly the sailors on the ship, and they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? I'll pause there. The sailors cast lots at this point to determine who is the guilty party amongst them. Remember, as I said before, they see a causal link between the storm outside and someone among them. So they believe that this storm is more than just the storm. They believe there's something inherently important here. It has all the hallmarks of a divine wrath being brought against someone on board. Now, of course, as we step away from the story, we know that to be true, right? So it's interesting that they also see that to be true. But they cast lots. Now, they may be casting lots out of what I call rank superstition, okay? Remember, as I said last week, these are polytheistic pagan people with little knowledge of the one true and living God. And they, of course, recognize that everything that happens is due to man's specific evil. So it could be that they're casting lots because they believe somebody is evil on board the ship. Couldn't help but notice the parallel to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. What was their assertion about Job? This evil has come upon you because of something you've done. Same exact thing. Somebody on this ship has done something evil, so therefore we need to figure out who it is. So maybe just out of rank superstition, they may be seeking to find out who it is. Or maybe out of a deep suspicion that Jonah is somehow involved. I mean, after all, think about it. He's a passenger on a cargo ship. That's a rather interesting coincidence, isn't it? Now, again, they would believe in coincidences. We, of course, do not. But they would be potentially sitting there going, the guy in the hold maybe is the problem? So the sailors decide to use a technique that they believe will reveal the guilty party. Now, casting lots was a common approach to seeking divine help in the first and second millennium BC. In fact, all the way up to the days of Christ, we know that this is the case. It was very common amongst the Semitic peoples in the Middle East and amongst the Jews in Jesus' day. We see it first used or one of the first times it's used is in Joshua chapter 18. You remember when they decide, okay, who's going to get what territory and what place? Joshua casts lots to see who was going to get the first choice of space. You see it in Matthew 27 when the Romans cast lots for the cloak of Jesus. So they didn't tear it, they cast lots to see who would get it. And then even in Acts 1, the apostles chose a replacement for Judas by casting lots. So it's a common thing, all right? It's not an unusual thing. In fact, if you stop and think about it for a moment, if God is sovereign over all things and you cast a lot, then you're putting it into the hands of the sovereign God to decide where it's going to fall, right? I mean, even the proverb writer says that in Proverbs 16:33, right? The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord, okay? So they cast lots with the intention of finding out who's the guilty party, and surprise, it falls on Jonah. So however they did it, it came up pointing to him. Now, this leads to my obvious first question. Why didn't Jonah just confess that he was the one responsible for the storm before they cast lots? You ever thought about that? Why did he let them go through the process of casting lots when he knew it was him? And when it fell on him, that shouldn't have surprised him at all. He must have known that the storm was due to his negligence. In fact, down in verse 12, it says, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." So he knows, right? So why doesn't he just go ahead and tell them? In verse 10, we're told, in verse 10, the second half of verse 10, we're told, "For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them." Okay, so there's a sub-question I want to put in there, okay, under that first question. Why didn't Jonah just confess? The sub-question is this. When did he tell them that he was running from the Lord? Okay, when did he tell them that? Our assertion or assumption by reading that is to assume that he told them at some point earlier. But if he had told them that, there'd be no reason for them to cast lots. They would know that he was running from the Lord. He would know he was. So what I think the writer is saying is after they had cast lots, he tells them that he is running. Otherwise, they would not have to get it out of him. I would say Jonah only later tells the sailors what's happening, okay? So why didn't Jonah just confess he was responsible? Well, let me suggest that Jonah didn't immediately confess because he was still in full-on rebellion against the Lord. He refused to concede that God was using this against him. He was still standing firm upon his resolute assertion that he was not going to do what the Lord had commanded him to do. I mean, even like his baby-like sleep in the hold, right? He was still convinced his choice was right. He was still convinced that he had made the right choice and it doesn't matter, I'm going forward. So he doesn't say anything. to them. Now, I'll bring back a principle that I brought to you last week. It's important, again, to say this. In 2 Corinthians 13:5, the Apostle Paul tells us that we who are followers of Christ must always be examining ourselves. We must always be examining ourselves. We must be ready and willing to admit our sin and seek reconciliation with God. It's easy for us to lie to ourselves, isn't it? It's unbelievably easy to lie to ourselves. It's unbelievably easy to assert that our position is right. Don't confuse me with the facts my mind is made up. Right? That's how we go through life. That's what we are able to do. But for those who have been born again by the Spirit of God, who have been given a new heart in Christ, we should be the first to pursue holiness, which is to pursue a confession of our sin and a willingness to admit that maybe we are wrong. Dare I say, even sinful. Examine ourselves at all times. Jonah is obviously not doing that. He's only interested in running from the Lord. So the sailors interrogate Jonah. Notice I use the word interrogate because that's exactly what they do. And they interrogate him as to his background. They bring to him several questions. First question is, on whose account is this evil? It's the primary query. It's really the most important one of the list. Are you the guilty party? And if so, why? Why are you the guilty party? For what reason has this event risen up against us? What have you done? Okay? Now, have you noticed, if you look down at verse 9 as Jonah responds, he does not actually answer this question. Okay? That will be important. The second question they ask him is, well, what is your occupation? All right, now it's a secondary question, but it goes along with the first. And they're probably thinking along the lines of, are you some sort of prophet or priest or seer or, something like that that this would be important about? I mean, that's why you would ask such a question about occupation, right? What is your occupation related to this storm? It implies some sense within them that Jonah was involved in some sort of religious activity. Remember, there's a bunch of pagans now, right? So they're just kind of assuming, maybe this guy is some sort of priest or something, and that this storm is related to that reality. Now, again, if you look at verse 9, Jonah does not actually answer that question. But the third question is the tertiary question. It's the third level question. Where do you come from? And what is your country? What people are you from, right? Where are you from? What is your ethnicity? Where do you come from as a person? And I think the reason why they ask this question is because you remember that typically different people are associated with different gods, right? Where you're from determines what gods you worship. So it's likely that they're saying what the gods you worship would be determined by your country of origin. That might tell us something about why this situation is happening to us. So tell us where you're from. Maybe that'll give us a clue as to what gods you people worship that would be causing this problem. Now, this is the question that Jonah answers in verse 9. So the sailors believe that Jonah is at fault. But, after all, the lot landed upon him, and so they turn to him and they ask him these questions, and they force him to give an answer as to why. Okay? So they spin these lots, falls on Jonah. Jonah is asked these questions in a form of interrogation. So Jonah now comes and confesses who he is and who he worships as God. Verse 9. And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. That's his quote. 3 parts to that. First, I am a Hebrew. I am a Hebrew. I am of the people ethnically descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I am a part of the people who are descended from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who were developed into a nation in Egypt, came out from Egypt and took the land of Canaan, and now occupy that particular territory, which is probably recognized by the men on the ship. They probably would have understood what that meant. Now, I have you note at this point by way of reminder, that Israel is a divided kingdom at this point. There are actually two Israels, if you will. Israel to the north, Judah to the south. So it's a divided kingdom. You'll notice that Jonah does not call himself an Israelite. So he doesn't actually say he's from Samaria and from the people of the north. He simply points that he's ethnically a Hebrew. So his point is to note which God he worships, not what part of Israel he's from. Okay, so when he says, I'm a Hebrew, he's simply pointing to the gods of the Hebrews, which again, I think the soldiers may have understood. So he then says, I fear the Lord, the God of heaven. Now, that should be translated in your Bible as, I fear Yahweh, the only God. Most of your Bibles have the word Lord in uppercase, which means that that's a reference to the divine name. So I fear Yahweh. I fear the God of heaven, the only God. Again, he's expressing his monotheistic view of the nature of God. And he goes on to describe Yahweh as the one who, quote, made the sea and the dry land, unquote. Now, notice the irony of that statement, right? Here you are in the midst of a storm, and it is God who made the seas. So he's referring to the creator God, or I could emphasize that as the creator God, the one who is in control of the physical universe, the one who can whip up storms because he is God, because he is the God of the land and the seas. See the irony in that confession? The irony in that confession is that Jonah makes a proper confession of his understanding of God, doesn't he? We would agree exactly with what he says. Yet it is against this God that Jonah is rebelling. His confession is true, absolutely true, but it's not applied to himself. He applies it to the sailors, he applies it to the sea, he applies it to everything around him but himself. It is possible to do that, by the way. So I am convinced that it's at this point, although it's not specifically said here, but it's said just a couple of verses later, that Jonah reveals the rest of the story. He reveals his occupation as a prophet. He reveals his flight from the calling of the Lord, the account of why this evil has come. In other words, he answers the other two questions. He doesn't answer them in the text, but he does answer them because, as they say, they know that. So here we have Jonah being confronted by a group of sailors in the midst of a storm. The wind is howling, the ship is rocking, the waves are breaking over the railing, and they're confronting Jonah in the midst of this tumult to get him to confess what it is that he has done that has brought this calamity upon them. So there's a logical and obvious question I have to ask you. How much effort does it take to get you to confess that you are a follower of Christ? How much effort does it take? How much effort does it take others to get that out of you? Do they see it naturally in your life and in your words? Do they hear it from you, or do they have to wring it out of you? Or, as someone much wiser than me once said, if you were put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Jonah has to be squeezed, if you will, by these men to confess something in the middle of something he should have known. It leads us to consider this as well for ourselves. I have a feeling that in the days ahead, those who follow Christ will be forced to give such confession as well. So then in verse 10, the sailors respond. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Now I want to ask a second question. Here's my second question in the 6 I'm going to ask this morning. And the question is, what are they afraid of? It says they're exceedingly afraid. What are they afraid of? What else could they possibly be frightened of? I mean, they're already close to death just by virtue of being on this ship that's being ripped apart. It sounds to me as though something else has gripped them to frighten them beyond just being on board a ship. Now, the assumption that we make here very often as we quickly read this story through, we just sort of skim through that like, oh yeah, they're afraid. The assumption that we make is they're afraid of being caught up in Jonah's sin. That they're being caught up in God looking to destroy Jonah and them along with him. Now, I'll have you notice something. They switch from the individual to the communal right here. See that? Prior to this, they're worried about which man amongst you is the guilty party. Now all of a sudden it becomes a communal guilt. Now all of a sudden, we're all in for it because of what this one guy did. See that? See that switch? It's subtle in there, but there it is. So sometimes I think our assumption is, well, the reason why they're all afraid is because they're afraid of getting caught up in whatever judgment is coming upon Jonah. But let me suggest to you something else that may actually be better, a better explanation. Jonah comes to them and says, I worship the only God. And guess what? They've just been introduced to him. They've just been introduced to him. His power is raging all around them at this point. Now, again, our natural tendency in our mind is to think about this story like, okay, there was a storm and now they're all standing around on the deck and they're all just kind of trying to figure this out. Ship is still going up and down and all around and it's threatening to be torn apart. They have just been introduced to the one true God. And this one true God is represented by Jonah. His existence in the face of their ignorant paganism is obviously evident and they don't know what to do about it. What are you going to do? When you are introduced to the one true and living God by virtue of his power and his wrath coming against you, what are you going to do? Look, I don't have this written in the outline, but I would say this. There's going to be a whole lot of people that are going to come face to face with Jesus Christ. And for the first time, they're going to be coming face to face with the one true and living God. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? And these men were exceedingly afraid. That is an understatement of a kind unimaginable for those who will stand before Christ. For the first time, they've encountered a living God as opposed to their fictional ones. They've encountered a God who's actually able to make things happen. They see it all around them. Up until this point, it's kind of like, well, we'll attribute that to God. We're not really sure. This time, something very real is taking place around them. The reasons for this storm have been made abundantly clear to them, and they are exceedingly afraid. What do we do now? What do we do now? This, by the way, is the constant question being asked of those who are coming to the presence of the living God, isn't it? What do we do now? So in verse 11, they asked Jonah for some advice. They said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. See that? It's not getting better, it's getting worse. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. So as the sailors are looking for solutions, the sea grows more and more tempestuous. In fact, you see that repeated in verse 11 and in verse 13. It's repeated twice. Okay? Don't want you to miss it. You got to put yourself in this story. Imagine you're sitting on board on the deck of a ship that's literally being tossed about to the point where you are afraid for your very life. Here you are. In fact, it's almost as though, exclamation point, it's almost as though God speaks to them, forcing them into what to do. So Jonah tells them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Do to me exactly what you did to all the cargo. Throw me overboard. Lighten the ship by throwing the source of your trouble overboard. Do to me what you did with the cargo. Lighten the ship of its load. Now, that leads me to another question. Why doesn't Jonah just say to the sailors, look, turn the ship around and I'll head to Nineveh? Right? Wouldn't that have been the better solution? Just turn the ship around. I mean, if the ship is in danger because I'm going the wrong way, wouldn't it stand to reason that turning around might solve the problem? But he doesn't say that, does he? Now, it is true that the sailors will try this approach. Look at verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. So they try that, but I want to know why Jonah doesn't suggest it. Why doesn't Jonah just say that? Now, I think the answer will be found in the next question. Question number 4. Why doesn't Jonah just jump overboard? Have you ever thought that? Have you ever asked that question about this story? Why doesn't Jonah just jump overboard? Why must they hurl him into the sea? Or I would ask it more specifically, why does he put the sailors in jeopardy before God? Notice down in verse 14, they call out to the Lord, "Oh Lord, let us not perish for this man's life." He puts them in danger. Why doesn't he just jump overboard? Kind of questions you really should be asking when you're reading a story like this, right? Because frankly, I found none of this to make any sense at all. And I think the only possible answer that you can come up with is because Jonah still refuses to go to Nineveh. He knows that certain death awaits him if they throw him in the sea. Now, don't think for 1 second that Jonah believes there's a great fish waiting for him, okay? You know that, but he don't know that. And nobody else on board that ship knows that. And in fact, frankly, if this is the first time you've read this story, if you've never read it before, you wouldn't assume that either. In my opinion, he is afraid of dying, so he won't commit suicide. But his stubbornness refuses to obey. He's caught between two self-inflicted realities. He can't go back and he can't go forward. He's stuck right here. Now, could we dare say that God put him in the dilemma? Anybody here want to make that case? What we have in Jonah here is something which is called a terrible case of cognitive dissonance. Are you familiar with this term? Cognitive dissonance. It's when a person possesses an inability or they're unable to see an inherent contradiction within their own position. They still hold it. They still hold it. It's the flaw within fallen humanity of fundamentally embracing two contradictory thoughts simultaneously. Two thoughts that don't go together, but I'm going to hold on to both of them. Because I want to believe both of them, even though they contradict each other. There are many examples that I could give, but the one that came to my mind was this one. A person who touts abortion as reproductive health, yet opposes capital punishment as barbaric. That's what you call cognitive dissonance. Two opposing viewpoints held simultaneously. And we could make many, many others. I mean, I was going to pick on the synergists here, but I decided not to. They have way too many of them. This is Jonah with two problems. I refuse to go to Nineveh, but I will not jump into the sea. So Jonah tells the sailors to toss him overboard in order for their lives to be spared. Jonah doesn't give us much detail of the event. but it must have been fascinating. Picking him up and chucking him overboard. Now, it says in verse 13, as I pointed out earlier, they did attempt to find an alternative solution. They rowed hard. Okay, they didn't want to accept Jonah's solution, so they tried to do what he hadn't suggested. Okay, they tried an alternative solution. They tried one better suited now to their fear of God, which was very much a part of them at this point, but they could not. I'm assuming here, of course, that God is still controlling the storm. I mean, after all, he hurled it, so one's got to believe he's still hurling it. So it would appear there was only one option for the sailors that God had pushed forward. Throw the man overboard. He won't do it himself, so you do it. So in verse 14, it says, "Therefore they called out to the Lord, 'O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you.'" Sound familiar? It does, right? You have done what you pleased to do. Now again, this leads me to another question. Why doesn't Jonah call out to the Lord here? Again, have you ever asked that question while going through this book? I mean, this entire scene, to me, if it were done by Hollywood, would be bizarre to watch. You can imagine the director going, what's Jonah's motivation right about here? Why doesn't Jonah cry out to the Lord? Why doesn't Jonah call out to the Lord when they said, "Let us not perish for this man's life"? Why doesn't he call out and say, "Oh Lord, do not let these men perish because of my failure"? But he doesn't do that. Isn't that bizarre? Again, I think it's another evidence that Jonah still refused to obey the call of God. Look, throw me into the sea. I'm not going to Nineveh. Ain't happening. And since I'm too chicken to jump over the rail, you pick me up and throw me. Which leads me to my sixth question. And this is probably the most difficult of all the questions that I've asked. When these men in verse 14 cry out to the Lord, "Let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood," does this make these men innocent of what they do? Because it appears to be God's will? Does it make them innocent of it? Now, I find it interesting that they claim Jonah's innocent blood. Not a chance. But for some reason, they call him that. I'm not exactly sure how they came to that conclusion. More than likely, what they're simply saying is, he is an image bearer of God, a human being, and thus for us to throw him overboard means we're sentencing him to death. They choose to do this thing, don't they? They try to justify it. They call out to God, "Hey, hold not his innocent blood against me." But does that make them innocent? I mean, I'll give you Pilate, right? He knew Jesus was innocent, didn't he? He knew. He had been told in a number of different ways. He found nothing in Jesus himself. So what did he do in Matthew 27:24? He took some water, he washed his hands, and he says, "I am innocent of this man's blood." Is Pilate going to stand before God and God say to him, "Well, you're innocent, you washed your hands of it"? And the answer to the question is a hard one, but it's one we must remember. No one will stand before God and justify his sinful actions as though they were part of the will of God. We have to remember that. It's easy for us to let these sailors off the hook because everything seems to be pointing to them chucking Jonah into the sea. But who's really at fault here? Jonah is at fault here. But that doesn't mean that just because Jonah is at fault that their actions, therefore, are justified. God may have boxed them into the corner, that's true. But they're still going to be held accountable for their sinful actions. We all are. We're all going to stand before the Lord and answer for what we have done. Now, the good news for those of us who are in Christ, Christ's blood has covered all of that, so our guilt is taken up in him and satisfied by his cross. But that doesn't mean we're innocent just because we have committed sinful actions in Christ. I mean, Paul even asked this question at the beginning of Romans 6. Well, look, if we're all under grace, should we just go sin more and more and more? Because after all, if we sin more, there's got to be more grace. Paul's response in the vernacular of our day would be something like, what's the matter with you? How do you think like that? That's not how human beings ought to think. God is holy and righteous. The sailors made a sinful choice just the way Pilate made a sinful choice. They were not coerced into it by a capricious God that used them for his dastardly purpose. Now, in this case, we'll notice that Jonah was actually saved by God from drowning. In other words, he mitigated their actions. That's true. As was his larger plan. And the circumstances in this situation ultimately vindicated the sailors, but they still made a choice to do what is sinful. We need to remember that. We need to remember that. You keep your theology straight. God is holy. He cannot do or tempt any man to do what is evil. They made that choice. So the sailors hurl him into the sea, and the Lord calmed the storm. Now, in verse 17, we are told that a great fish is appointed by the Lord to swallow up Jonah, and we will look at that as a part of our next pericope. But I want to go back to something that happens in verse 16. Back in verse 16, it says that they fear the Lord greatly. In other words, they fear Yahweh, because again, that's the word for Lord. You see it in verse 14 3 different times. And then you see it again in verse 16 twice. So it's really the name of God appears 5 different times in those 2 verses. So they fear Yahweh. They fear the one true God. And in verse 16 it says that they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Now, I would have you to notice here that in the midst of that previous question, which might trouble you, the Lord used all of this to draw a few pagan sailors to himself, didn't he? He used all of this, Jonah's disobedience, the storm, etc. He used all of it in an act of great mercy. Isn't it interesting that God had intended to show mercy to the Ninevites, but in the process of Jonah being disobedient, he shows mercy to a few sailors. I want to call them soldiers. I don't know why. Sailors. He intended, God did, he intended for Jonah to go east in order to bring good news to the Ninevites. Jonah's sinful response to go to the west meant that these sailors came to know him. The Lord revealed himself to them through this. It's an example of something that we call the inscrutability of God. The inscrutability of God. The word inscrutable is a word that means something utterly unknown or unknowable. God is inscrutable in that he is so beyond us that we cannot really comprehend him. We try, right? We create little boxes and we put God in those little boxes and we establish the boundaries of what it is that God is supposed to look like when he sits in that box. But the reality is that God is inscrutable. He is beyond our ability to understand. And as you go back through this story, you see this inscrutability of God. How is it possible that God would actually wind up bringing some sailors on a ship in the Mediterranean to himself, to the point where they actually offer sacrifice and make vows to him, a group of men who didn't know him? How did he do that? He sent a rebel to them. He sent a rebellious man. Now, we know it was Jonah's choice, right? We know that it was Jonah's decision. By the way, to answer the previous question, whose fault is it? It's Jonah's fault, right? So is Jonah going to stand before God and be innocent on this? Not a chance. So here we have God allowing, sending, ordaining, whichever word you want to use, this rebel to this ship, and then sends a storm to whip it up, all for the purpose of bringing some pagan soldiers, sailors, see, I did it again, sailors to himself. I've come to realize that soldiers are all pagans, but, sailors. He brings them. Isn't that interesting? God's ways are so far above our ways, we can't even begin to fathom what he can do in the midst of our lives. He is inscrutable in that he can develop history, the formation and rolling of human history, to the point where his own son can come into the world and die on a cross at the hands of a wicked Roman. He can do that. He can do that. We can't even fathom how to do virtually anything in our lives. Every day we question, is this going to work? And God can do whatever he wills. He can do whatever he wills. And so God can take even this wickedness of both Jonah and the sailors, he can use both to bring about good. This is what we mean when we say that God is inscrutable. His ways are so high above us, we can't even fathom it. So when we talk about the sovereignty of God in the sense that he is ordaining all things, and even as we talked last week about him using in his providence the various means that he uses to accomplish his will, what he's doing is he's doing what is beyond your comprehension. Even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it, right? God accomplishes a great thing through all of this. And he's not done, because he's appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah and bring him back. Which, by the way, if you want to talk about inscrutable, there you go. Because how many of you would have thought of that? Not many of us. So what we have in this section, what I called, remember I called it B1, which is between Jonah's disobedience and Jonah's prayer. This section in between, where Jonah is dealing with the sailors, God uses all of it through all these really bizarre ways of things go about to accomplish a great thing. And he brings honor to himself through it. Because I would ask you this question, who's the primary character of this story? Is it Jonah? No. Is it the sailors? No. It's the one who is dealing with them. Don't forget that as you read the story.